After nearly 7 years on death row, Marilyn K. Plants faced her end in Oklahoma. She was 40 years old when the lethal injection took her life inside the death chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. By then, her name had already been etched into the state's criminal history, not just as a murderer, but as the suburban mother who plotted her husband's killing for life insurance money and the first woman executed in Oklahoma in nearly a century. At 6:18 p.m. on May 1, 2001, Marilyn was pronounced dead. Her final words were a quiet invocation of faith. "I love all of you. I will see you all when you get there, okay?" She never denied her role, but she never fully accepted it either, leaving behind a legacy of betrayal that shattered the illusion of a picture-perfect family in Midwest City. In her final years, Marilyn had portrayed herself as a victim of manipulation, drawn into murder by a younger lover. She told interviewers she never meant for her husband to die, that it had all gone too far. But the horror of what happened could never be undone. A husband ambushed in his own house, a man beaten and burned in the car he once drove to work. The execution drew protests and quiet reflection across Oklahoma. Not because of Marilyn's innocence, but because her case reignited old debates about the death penalty, gender, and motive. It was August 26, 1988, in a quiet neighborhood of Midwest City, just east of Oklahoma City. Inside a modest home lived James Plants, a 33-year-old refinery worker and father of two, known for his steady work ethic, his devotion to family, and his quiet trust in the woman he believed would never betray him. He didn't know that by the time he pulled into his driveway that night, his fate had already been sealed by the person he loved most. Behind the plan was Marilyn, a church-going mother who had grown distant in her marriage and fallen for a teenage coworker named William Bryson. Together, they plotted to kill James for a $300,000 life insurance policy, promising a new life funded by blood. Bryson recruited his friend Clinton McKimble, and the two waited in the shadows as James came home. Within minutes, a husband was beaten, a car was set ablaze, and a family was destroyed. At first, the crime seemed like a random carjacking, a robbery gone wrong. But as investigators dug deeper, the truth unraveled quickly. A story of infidelity, greed, and betrayal that exposed how far Marilyn had gone to escape the life she no longer wanted. But to understand how Marilyn Plants, once a small-town girl and devoted mother, became the woman who orchestrated her husband's murder and met her own death by lethal injection, we have to go back to her early years in Oklahoma, to the struggles and choices that shaped her, back to the moment when temptation turned into conspiracy and love turned into murder. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Marilyn K. Sellers was born on October 19, 1960, in a rural area near Oklahoma City. She was the youngest of 6 children in a working-class family that struggled to make ends meet. Her father worked long hours while her mother managed the household. The family lived simply, and money was always tight. Growing up in the 1960s and 70s, Marilyn attended local schools but never felt she fit in. She was quiet and kept to herself most of the time. Her siblings were much older, and by the time she reached her teenage years, most had already left home. The house felt empty, and Marilyn spent much of her time alone. Her childhood was marked by strict discipline. Her father believed in firm rules and expected his children to follow them without question. When they didn't, punishment followed. The household was tense, and children learned early to avoid causing trouble. For Marilyn, this meant staying quiet and out of the way. At school, Marilyn was an average student who didn't stand out in any particular way. She had few close friends and rarely participated in activities. As she entered high school, Marilyn began to feel trapped by her circumstances. The small-town life felt suffocating. She watched as her older siblings escaped one by one, starting their own lives elsewhere. She wanted that same freedom, but didn't see a clear path forward. During her sophomore year, Marilyn met James Plants. He was a few years older and already working. To 15-year-old Marilyn, Jim represented stability and a way out of her family home. He had a steady job at the newspaper and seemed reliable. More importantly, he paid attention to her when few others did not. The relationship developed quickly. Within months, Marilyn became pregnant. At 15, she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. Her family, traditional and religious, pushed for marriage. Jim agreed. Neither had much choice in the matter given the social expectations of their community. At 16 years old, Marilyn K. Sellers became Marilyn Plants. She dropped out of high school and moved into a small apartment with Jim. The marriage certificate was signed in a brief ceremony attended by immediate family members. There was no celebration, no honeymoon. Marilyn traded one small house for another, exchanging her father's rules for a husband's expectations. Their first child, Trina, was born in 1979. Christopher followed a few years later. Marilyn spent her days caring for two young children, while Jim worked nights at the daily Oklahoman newspaper. She had become a mother and wife before she understood what either role meant. The teenage years she might have spent finding herself were instead spent changing diapers and preparing meals. By her mid-20s, Marilyn had never lived on her own. She went from her father's house directly into marriage. She had never finished school, never had a career, never experienced independence. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being someone's daughter, then someone's wife, then someone's mother. She had no idea who Marilyn was outside of those roles. For 11 years, the Plants' marriage looked stable from the outside. Neighbors in their Midwest city neighborhood saw a typical family. Jim left for work each evening in his work clothes. Marilyn stayed home with the children during the day. The house was kept clean. The lawn was mowed. Nothing appeared wrong. Marilyn became active in their local church. She taught Sunday school classes for young children, standing in front of kids each week with Bible stories and coloring sheets. Other church members saw her as a devoted mother doing her best. The church community provided social connections that filled her days while Jim slept after his night shifts. The schedule of Jim's work created an unusual family dynamic. When most families were together in the evenings, Jim was at the newspaper. Marilyn ate dinner with the children alone. She put them to bed alone. She woke up with them alone. For large portions of each day, she functioned as a single parent even though she was married. Jim came home around 4 a.m. most mornings. He would sleep through much of the day while Marilyn handled the children and household tasks. By the time he woke up in the afternoon, he had a few hours before leaving for work again. This pattern repeated itself year after year. The family existed in two separate time zones, rarely occupying the same waking hours together. Jim's family saw nothing concerning about the marriage. His sisters, Karen Lowery and Sharon Cotton, spent time with the couple and never witnessed arguments. Karen later said the relationship seemed perfect, with no raised voices or tension. Marilyn told people she and Jim had a good marriage. When asked, she described her husband as hardworking and dependable. He provided for the family financially and never caused problems. He didn't drink heavily or stay out late. He came straight home from work. By conventional standards, Jim was a good husband. But beneath the surface, Marilyn was deeply unhappy. She had married at 16 to escape one situation and found herself trapped in another. Her entire adult life had been spent in this house, with these children, waiting for Jim to come and go on his work schedule. She had no education beyond high school freshman year. She had no work experience or job skills. She had no money of her own. At 27 years old in 1987, Marilyn looked at her life and saw nothing but more of the same stretching ahead. Another 20 years of the same routine. She began to resent Jim, though she never voiced these feelings to him. He hadn't done anything specifically wrong. He worked hard and provided for the family, but his presence represented everything she felt she had lost. Every time she looked at him, she saw the life she never got to live, the education she never completed, the freedom she never experienced, the person she might have become if she hadn't gotten pregnant at 15. Marilyn started to feel that her life had happened to her rather than being something she chose. Marilyn started to feel that her life had happened to her, rather than being something she chose. The perfect marriage that everyone saw from the outside was, from Marilyn's perspective, a prison sentence with no release date. That quiet dissatisfaction began to fester, slowly, invisibly, until it became a hunger for something different, something exciting, something that made her feel alive again. And in the summer of 1988, she found it. But the person who would awaken that side of her wasn't a charming man from her past, or a stranger who swept her off her feet. He was William Clifford Bryson Jr., a boy half her age, with a troubled past and a dangerous lack of direction. William Clifford Bryson Jr. was born in 1970 into circumstances that offered little stability from the start. His mother, Yolanda Butler, was only 15 years old when she gave birth to him. She was a child herself, unprepared and unable to handle the responsibilities of motherhood. The pregnancy and birth happened quickly, and Yolanda never adjusted to her new reality. Within months of Clifford's birth, Yolanda made a decision. She couldn't raise him. Whether from inability or unwillingness, she gave up her baby to the Oklahoma Department of Human Services. Clifford became a ward of the state before he was old enough to remember his mother's face. There was no family support system to step in. Yolanda disappeared from his life almost entirely. Clifford spent his first years moving through Oklahoma's foster care system. He lived with different families in different homes, never staying long enough to form lasting bonds. Each placement was temporary. Each set of foster parents was provisional. He learned early that adults came and went, that homes were temporary, and that nothing was permanent. The foster system tried to find him a stable home, but the process moved slowly. Paperwork piled up. Caseworkers changed. Clifford continued moving from house to house. Some foster families were kind. Others were simply fulfilling a contract. None became his real family during those early years. Finally, when Clifford was still young, his paternal grandparents emerged from the bureaucratic maze. They fought through the system's paperwork and requirements to gain custody of their grandson. It took considerable time and effort, but eventually they succeeded. Clifford moved in with his father's parents and finally had a permanent home. His grandfather was a church janitor who worked modest hours for modest pay. The family didn't have much money, but they had enough. More importantly, they provided stability that Clifford had never known. The grandparents raised him as their own son, giving him structure and routine. For the first time, Clifford had a real home. Despite his grandparents' efforts, Clifford carried the weight of his early years. He knew his mother hadn't wanted him. He knew he had been given away. He knew other children lived with their actual parents, while he lived with grandparents who had already raised their own children. These facts shaped how he saw himself and his place in the world. By the time Clifford reached his teenage years in the mid-1980s, he attended local Oklahoma City schools. He was a quiet student who didn't cause major problems, but didn't excel either. Teachers saw him as unremarkable. He had a few friends, but wasn't particularly social. He seemed to float through school without much direction or purpose. At 16, Clifford was slim and short for his age. He looked younger than he was. He didn't play sports or participate in activities. He spent time with a small circle of friends who, like him, seemed to be killing time rather than building futures. They hung out at convenience stores and parking lots with nothing particular to do. Clifford had no clear plans for his future. He wasn't headed to college. He had no trade skills or interests. He simply existed day to day, doing what teenagers do when they have no direction. His grandparents worried about him, but didn't know how to reach him. He wasn't in serious trouble, but he wasn't thriving either. In late 1987, when Clifford was 16, he worked part-time at various odd jobs around Oklahoma City. Nothing steady or meaningful, just enough to have spending money. He lived with his grandparents and followed their rules, but the relationship lacked the natural bond between parents and children. That same year, Clifford met someone who would change the entire direction of his life. He met Marilyn Plants. She was 27, married, the mother of 2 young children. He was 16, living with his grandparents, drifting through life without guidance or goals. The age difference was significant. The circumstances were inappropriate, but for Clifford, who had spent his life feeling unwanted and unseen, Marilyn represented something new. She noticed him. She listened. She made him feel valued, perhaps for the first time in his life. The relationship between Marilyn Plants and Clifford Bryson began in late 1987, though neither would ever publicly specify exactly how they met. What is known is that a 27-year-old married mother of two began spending time with a 16-year-old boy. At first, the connection seemed harmless enough. Bryson did odd jobs around the neighborhood, and Marilyn may have hired him for yard work or small repairs. They started talking. Marilyn paid attention to the teenager in ways that made him feel important. For Bryson, who had grown up moving from one foster home to another, always feeling unwanted, this attention was intoxicating. Marilyn made him feel seen, heard, and valued in a way no one else had. For Marilyn, Bryson represented something entirely different. He was young, impulsive, and full of the freedom she felt she had lost long ago. She saw in him the life she never got to live, the teenage years cut short by an early pregnancy and an unfulfilled marriage. By the spring of 1988, the relationship had crossed a line. It was no longer just about companionship. They became sexually involved, despite the clear illegality of the affair. Marilyn knew the risks, but the secrecy seemed to thrill her. Her husband, Jim Plants, worked nights, leaving home around 6 p.m. and returning at 4 a.m. Once the children, Trina and Christopher, went to bed, Marilyn had long, empty hours. She used that time to invite Bryson over. He started coming to the Plants' home under cover of darkness. Marilyn would let him in quietly after the kids were asleep. They'd spend hours together talking, drinking, and being intimate. Marilyn gave him money, bought him alcohol and drugs, and even let him drive her car. The affair thrived in the quiet of those nights, hidden behind drawn curtains and the illusion of a perfect family. To outsiders, Marilyn's marriage seemed stable. Jim worked hard and provided for his family. But behind closed doors, Marilyn told a very different story. She began confiding in Bryson, saying she felt trapped, that Jim controlled all the money, that she had no independence. She told him she was miserable, that she couldn't breathe inside that house, that she had married too young, that life had passed her by. Over time, these complaints turned darker. By early summer 1988, Marilyn stopped talking about wanting to leave Jim. Instead, she began talking about wanting him gone. Not divorced. Gone. She talked about how much easier her life would be if Jim weren't alive, how she could finally be free. She also mentioned that Jim had a large life insurance policy through his job, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If something happened to him, she said, she and Bryson could use that money to start a new life together. These conversations happened more often, each one pushing Bryson deeper into her fantasy. She framed it as love and rescue, as if ending Jim's life was an act of liberation for them both. Bryson, still a teenager, believed her. He claimed Marilyn showed him bruises, saying Jim had hurt her. He said she cried about being beaten, about being afraid. Whether these stories were true or not, Bryson didn't question them. The idea that he was saving the woman he loved made him feel powerful. What began as an illicit romance was turning into something much darker. A murder conspiracy forming behind the walls of a suburban Oklahoma home. But as their secret relationship intensified, their choices began pulling others into their orbit, including a young man named Clinton Eugene. Clinton Eugene McKimmey was 18 years old in 1988, living in Oklahoma City without much direction or purpose. Like many young men in similar circumstances, he drifted through life one day at a time, rarely thinking about the future. He had finished high school but hadn't gone on to college or any kind of training. He took odd jobs when he could, nothing steady, nothing that paid much. McKimmey came from a working-class family. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't destitute either. Life was predictable, simple, and limited. People worked hard, earned little, and expected nothing more than survival. By his late teens, McKimmey had fallen in with a loose group of aimless young men who spent their nights hanging out around gas stations, convenience stores, and fast food parking lots across Oklahoma City. They weren't a gang, just restless kids with too much time and too little purpose. Through this casual social circle, McKimmy met Clifford Bryson in the spring of 1988. Bryson was a few years younger, but they ran in the same circles. They weren't close friends at first, just familiar faces. But they'd talk occasionally, hang out in groups, or share a drink. McKimmy noticed something odd. Bryson often had cash. He always seemed to be able to buy alcohol, gas, or drugs, even though he didn't have a job. When McKimmy asked about it, Bryson smiled and said a woman gave him money. She was older, he said, married but lonely. As the weeks passed, Bryson talked about her more often. Her name was Marilyn. She had a husband who worked nights and 2 kids. She liked having Bryson around, he said, because she was lonely and unhappy in her marriage. At first, McKimmy didn't think much of it. Older women seeing younger men wasn't unheard of. But Bryson's stories kept getting more emotional, more serious. He started saying Marilyn's husband was abusive, that she came to him crying, that she had bruises from being beaten. Bryson painted Marilyn as a victim and himself as her protector, the only one who cared enough to save her. McKimmy didn't know if any of it was true. He had never met the husband, never seen proof. But Bryson seemed sincere. And when he talked about wanting to help Marilyn, it sounded like something more than teenage fantasy. Then, in July 1988, Bryson came to McKimmy with a question that changed everything. He asked if McKimmy would be willing to help Marilyn. When McKimmy asked what kind of help, Bryson said Marilyn needed someone to deal with her husband. The conversation was vague, but the meaning was clear. Violence was being discussed. At first, McKimmy didn't take it seriously, but Bryson kept bringing it up, and soon money entered the equation. He said Marilyn had access to her husband's life insurance policy, and if Jim were dead, she'd collect a big payout. They could all share in it. The more Bryson talked, the more real it sounded. The amounts mentioned grew larger, first a few $1,000s, then tens of thousands. Finally, Bryson introduced McKimmy to Marilyn herself. She was calm, composed, and polite, not the hysterical abuse victim McKimmy had imagined. But her message matched Bryson's words. She told McKimmy directly that she wanted her husband gone. She said she needed help, and she would pay for it. From that moment, the situation stopped being theoretical. The conversations had crossed the line into planning. Marilyn began allowing Bryson to bring McKimmy to her home. After her children went to bed, the 3 of them would drink, do drugs, and talk late into the night. In the same house where Jim Plant slept during the day, unaware that a plan for his death was forming, Marilyn encouraged the bond between the 2 young men, buying their loyalty with cash, alcohol, and attention. The more time they spent together, the less any of them seemed to grasp how far things had gone. By late July, the plan was set in motion. Marilyn was no longer just having an affair with a teenage boy. She was orchestrating a murder, and both Bryson and McKimmy had agreed to help. Money problems weren't obvious in the Plant's household, but financial pressure was always there beneath the surface. Jim's job at the newspaper paid decent wages for blue-collar work, but it wasn't making them wealthy. With 2 children, a mortgage, and regular bills, money was carefully managed rather than abundant. Every dollar had a purpose. Jim was responsible about finances. He paid bills on time and didn't spend recklessly. He saved what he could and provided steadily for his family. But he also worked the night shift, which meant Marilyn handled most of the daily financial decisions. She bought groceries, paid for children's needs, and managed the household budget while Jim slept. This arrangement meant Marilyn was acutely aware of the family's financial limitations. She saw exactly how much money came in and how quickly it went out. She couldn't buy things spontaneously without affecting the budget. She couldn't make major purchases without discussing them with Jim first. Every significant expense required coordination. For someone who already felt trapped by her marriage, the financial constraints added another layer of frustration. Marilyn had no income of her own. She had no bank account in just her name. She had no credit cards she controlled independently. Everything was joint or in Jim's name because he was the earner. This was standard for many marriages at the time, but it left Marilyn completely dependent. If Marilyn wanted to leave Jim, she would face immediate financial disaster. She had no recent work history to put on a resume. She had no completed education. She had no job skills that would earn decent wages. She would need to find housing, pay for childcare, and support 2 children on whatever low-wage work she could find. The math didn't work. Staying was financially necessary, even if emotionally unbearable. But there was one financial asset in the family that could change everything. Jim had life insurance through his employer at the Daily Oklahoman. The policy was substantial, as many workplace policies were. The exact amount varied in later reports, but estimates ranged from $299,000 to $319,000. For a working-class family in 1988, this represented an enormous sum of money. Jim had the insurance policy because he was responsible. If something happened to him, he wanted his family protected. The policy would pay off the house, cover the children's expenses, and give Marilyn financial security. It was meant to provide for his family if he died in an accident or from illness. It never occurred to Jim that the policy itself could become a motive for murder. Marilyn knew about the insurance policy. She knew the approximate value. She knew that if Jim died, she was the beneficiary. That money would solve all her problems. She could pay off debts, keep the house, and have enough left over to live comfortably. She wouldn't need to work immediately. She wouldn't need to struggle financially as a single mother. The insurance payout would give her the independence and freedom she craved. The policy became central to Marilyn's thinking as her relationship with Bryson intensified. She talked about the insurance money frequently. She mentioned it to Bryson repeatedly. She told McKimball about it directly. The money wasn't just a bonus that would come if they killed Jim. It was the primary motivation. Without the insurance policy, there was no financial incentive for murder. Marilyn presented the murder plan to Bryson and McKimball as a solution that benefited everyone. Jim would be gone. Marilyn would be free. The insurance money would be split among them. She and Bryson could leave Oklahoma and start over somewhere else with plenty of money. McKimball would get his share and could do whatever he wanted. Everyone won except Jim. The insurance company had issued the policy assuming normal risk. They calculated premiums based on Jim's age, health, and occupation. They never considered that his wife might arrange his murder to collect the payout. The policy was meant to protect against tragedy, not create an incentive for it. As plans became more concrete over summer 1988, Marilyn emphasized the insurance money to keep Bryson and McKimball committed. She promised specific amounts. She talked about what they could do with the money. She made it seem certain that the insurance company would simply pay out and no one would question Jim's death. Marilyn's understanding of how insurance investigations worked was naive. She believed that if Jim's death looked like an accident, the insurance company would pay quickly and completely. She didn't consider that large payouts trigger automatic investigations. She didn't think about beneficiary scrutiny when deaths happen soon after policy increases. She saw the insurance money as a guaranteed payday rather than a potential source of suspicion. This miscalculation would prove crucial. The first serious discussion about actually killing Jim Plants happened in early summer 1988. Until then, Marilyn's complaints about her marriage had been just complaints. But in June or July, the tone changed. Marilyn stopped talking about being unhappy and started talking about solving the problem permanently. She wanted Jim dead, and she needed help making it happen. Marilyn presented the idea to Bryson directly. She told him that killing Jim was the only way she could be free. Divorce would leave her poor and struggling, but if Jim died, the insurance money would give them everything they needed. She framed it as their only option for a future together. Bryson, at 16, didn't have the maturity or judgment to recognize the manipulation. Marilyn came up with the first plan. She gave Bryson a gun and told him to shoot Jim. The shooting could be staged to look like robbery or random violence. Bryson took the gun, but never used it for the intended purpose. When Marilyn asked about the plan, Bryson made excuses. The first attempt ended before it began. The second plan involved Marilyn luring Jim home from work early. Bryson and McKimble would hide in the house and ambush him when he arrived. They discussed using knives or blunt objects, but this plan also fell through. The logistics were complicated, and no one followed through with actually setting it up. A third plan suggested pushing Jim off a boat during a fishing trip. Jim loved fishing, so getting him on a boat wouldn't be suspicious. If he drowned in a lake, it could easily look like an accident. Water deaths were hard to investigate thoroughly, but this plan required access to a boat and a location, and the details never came together. Throughout these failed planning attempts, Marilyn brought McKimble more deeply into the conspiracy. She met with him directly, without Bryson present. She confirmed that she wanted Jim dead and would pay for help. She offered McKimble increasingly large sums of money. First $7,000, then $10,000, then more. The amounts kept rising as Marilyn tried to ensure commitment. Marilyn also tried to recruit others beyond Bryson and McKimble. She approached at least two other young men, Chris Cato and Mario Houston, about killing Jim. She offered them money. She explained the insurance policy. She tried the same recruitment tactics she used on Bryson and McKimble. Both men refused. She also enlisted Bryson to recruit his friend Roderick Eugene Ferris. Bryson offered Ferris $40,000 to kill Jim. He explained that the victim's wife wanted it done and would pay from insurance money. Ferris refused, but listened to enough details. When Ferris asked why Marilyn didn't just divorce Jim, Bryson explained she wanted to collect money instead. One evening, Marilyn went so far as to have Ferris, Bryson, and McKimble wait in her house for Jim to come home. She served them hamburgers and put on music while they waited for Jim's shift to end. When they heard someone at the door, Marilyn told them if it was Jim to take him out now. Bryson grabbed a hammer and McKimble grabbed a knife. But it wasn't Jim at the door, and the plan dissolved. Ferris was arrested that same night on unrelated charges, removing him from future plans. By August 1988, multiple plans had failed, and multiple people had refused to help. But Marilyn didn't give up. Each failure only seemed to make her more determined. She focused her efforts on Bryson and McKimble, the only two who remained willing to actually go through with murder. The planning became more specific and more urgent as summer drew to an end. On August 17, 1988, Marilyn orchestrated the most serious attempt yet. This effort went beyond planning and moved into actual execution. For the first time, concrete steps were taken to kill Jim Plants. The plan required a vehicle that couldn't be traced to any of them. Bryson, McKimble, and another young man named Rory Jenkins stole a car specifically for this purpose. Marilyn helped coordinate the theft, though she didn't participate directly. The stolen vehicle would be used to run Jim off the road on his drive home from work, making his death look like a traffic accident. The three young men positioned themselves along the route Jim normally took home from the Daily Oklahoman. They knew his shift ended around 4 a.m. They knew which roads he usually traveled. They waited in the stolen car, watching for Jim's truck to appear. When it did, they began following him. The plan was simple in theory. They would force Jim's truck off the road at a spot where it would appear he lost control. Maybe he fell asleep at the wheel after a long shift. Maybe he swerved to avoid an animal. The death would look unfortunate but accidental. The insurance company would have no reason to suspect murder. But the plan immediately ran into problems. Jim didn't take his usual route that morning. Whether by chance or some instinct about the car following him, Jim drove differently than expected. The roads he chose didn't offer good opportunities for the staged accident. The young men had to improvise, which made them uncertain. More significantly, Jenkins got cold feet. As they followed Jim's truck, the reality of what they were about to do became clear. Jenkins hadn't thought through what it meant to actually kill someone. Theory was one thing. Actually forcing someone off the road to their death was another. Jenkins told Bryson and McKimble he didn't want to go through with it. Without full commitment from all three, the plan collapsed. They stopped following Jim and abandoned the stolen car. Jim drove home safely, completely unaware he had just escaped a murder attempt. He probably never noticed the car following him. He went home, saw his sleeping wife and children, and went to bed himself, thinking it was just another normal morning. Marilyn was furious when Bryson told her the attempt had failed. She had put effort into coordinating the stolen car and the timing. She had gotten them positioned correctly, and they had failed to follow through. She blamed Jenkins for not having the courage to see it through. She pushed Bryson and McKimble to try again without involving anyone else. The failed attempt made the conspiracy more real for everyone involved. For Bryson and McKimble, the failure should have been a warning. They had felt the reality of what murder meant and hadn't been able to do it. That moment of hesitation was their conscience trying to stop them. But instead of backing out entirely, they continued planning with Marilyn. Marilyn increased pressure after the failed attempt. She emphasized the money more. She talked about how much longer she could endure living with Jim. She made Bryson feel responsible for rescuing her. She framed the failed attempt as cowardice rather than wisdom. She pushed them to try again with a different method. The attempt also showed Marilyn that getting others involved created problems. Jenkins quit. Ferris had refused. Other young men she approached wanted nothing to do with murder. The conspiracy needed to be smaller and tighter. Only people completely committed could be involved. That meant Marilyn, Bryson, and McKimble. No one else. In the days following the failed attempt, the three of them discussed what went wrong and how to avoid similar problems next time. They needed a plan that didn't depend on precise timing or routes. They needed something more direct and more certain. They needed to control the situation completely rather than reacting to circumstances. The conversations led them toward a simpler, more brutal approach. Instead of following Jim and trying to stage an accident, they would wait for him at home. They would ambush him in his own house, where they controlled everything. The setting would be familiar, so they wouldn't be reacting to surprises. They could plan every detail and execute it exactly. This approach required more direct violence. They would have to attack Jim physically rather than forcing his truck off the road. Marilyn thought through the logistics carefully. Jim's shift ended around 4 a.m. He drove straight home, usually arriving around 4:15 or 4:30. The children would be sound asleep at that hour. She could send them to bed around 8 or 9 p.m. as usual. By the time Jim came home, they would be deeply asleep and unlikely to wake up even if there was noise. The weapons would be baseball bats, specifically the bats that belonged to 6-year-old Christopher. Jim had bought the bats to teach his son baseball. They were kept in the house for when Jim had time to practice with Christopher. The bats were heavy enough to cause serious damage, but common enough not to raise questions. They were part of normal household items. The attack would happen in the entrance area where Jim always came in. Bryson and Kimball would hide on either side of the door. When Jim walked in, they would hit him immediately before he understood what was happening. The element of surprise would prevent him from fighting back effectively. Two attackers with weapons against one tired man carrying groceries would overwhelm him quickly. After the attack, Jim's death needed to look like an accident. That's where fire came in. They would take Jim's body, place it in his truck, and burn the truck at a location that made sense for his route home. The fire would destroy evidence of the beating. By the evening of August 25th, everyone was committed. McKimble was promised $45,000. Bryson believed he was rescuing Marilyn from abuse. Marilyn wanted freedom and money. Each had their reasons for moving forward. The plan was set. They would wait for Jim to leave for work that evening, then gather at the Plants' house to wait for his return. Jim Plants woke up in the afternoon of August 25, 1988, after sleeping through the morning and early afternoon following his overnight shift. It was a normal day. He spent time with Trina and Christopher. He had dinner with his family before his 6 p.m. departure for work. Nothing about the day suggested it would be his last. Around 6 p.m., Jim left for his shift at the Daily Oklahoman. He drove to the newspaper plant and clocked in for work. His coworkers saw him at his usual time, in his usual condition. He supervised the press room through the night, overseeing the printing of the morning edition. The work was routine. The shift was normal. Everything proceeded as it had, hundreds of times before. After Jim left for work, Marilyn put her plan in motion. She picked up Bryson. They drove to a bank where Marilyn withdrew money from the joint account she shared with Jim. With cash in hand, they purchased crack cocaine and beer. The drugs and alcohol were meant to pass time while they waited for Jim's shift to end hours later. They returned to the Plants' house in Midwest City, with McKimble joining them. The three sat in the living room, the same room where the Plants family normally spent evenings together. Bryson and McKimble smoked crack cocaine while Marilyn drank beer. The children were home but were sent to bed at their normal time. Around 8 or 9 p.m., Trina went to her room, Christopher went to his. Neither child knew what was being planned in their living room. By 10:30 p.m., Marilyn went to her bedroom. She told Bryson and McKimble to wait in the living room. They continued drinking beer and smoking cocaine. The drugs and alcohol served multiple purposes. They passed time. They numbed their conscience. They created courage for what was coming. By 11:30 p.m., both young men passed out on the furniture, exhausted from the drugs and the waiting. Jim's shift at the newspaper continued through the night. He did his job, supervised his crew, and kept the presses running. Around 4 a.m. his shift ended. He clocked out and headed for his truck. Before going home, he stopped at a store and picked up a bag of groceries. Jim drove home through the empty early morning streets of Oklahoma City. There was no traffic at that hour. The drive took about 15 minutes. He had made this drive thousands of times over 15 years of working nights. He knew every turn and every light. His truck pulled into the driveway at the house on the quiet street in Midwest City around 4:15 a.m. Inside the house, Bryson and McKimble woke to the sound of keys jingling in the front door. The noise startled them out of their drug and alcohol-induced sleep. They jumped up, suddenly alert despite their earlier unconsciousness. Marilyn had told them exactly what to do when Jim arrived. They moved quickly to their positions. Bryson grabbed one baseball bat. McKimble grabbed the other. They positioned themselves on opposite sides of the entrance area, exactly as planned. Their hearts pounded. The drugs were still in their systems. Everything felt surreal and too real at the same time. They heard the key turn in the lock. Jim opened his front door and stepped into his house carrying the bag of groceries. He was whistling. After a long shift, he was almost home free. Just put away the groceries, kiss his sleeping wife, and go to bed. He had done this routine countless times. The house was dark except for the small light that guided him inside. He never saw the two figures hiding on either side of the doorway. Bryson struck first. The baseball bat hit Jim on the back of his head. The impact was massive. Jim cried out for Marilyn. He dropped the groceries. He tried to turn around to defend himself, but McKimble was already swinging the second bat. It connected with Jim's head. Bryson hit him again. Jim fought to stay on his feet. He cried out again for Marilyn, his wife, the person he thought would help him. But Marilyn stayed in her bedroom, listening to her husband being beaten to death. She didn't come to help. She didn't call police. She waited exactly as she had planned to wait. The beating continued. Bryson and McKimble later said they hit Jim repeatedly because he wouldn't stay down. Jim's survival instinct kept him trying to get up, trying to defend himself, trying to escape the attack. But he was one exhausted man against two attackers with weapons. The outcome was never in doubt. Finally, Jim stopped moving. He collapsed on the floor. Blood pooled around him. His skull was fractured from the repeated impacts. The attack had lasted only minutes, but had destroyed him completely. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Past Files and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover more stories that expose the darker side of human nature. Marilyn emerged from her bedroom where she had waited during the attack. She looked at her husband's body. She looked at the blood. She saw immediately that the scene didn't look like an accident. The blood pattern showed violence. Jim's injuries were clearly from being beaten. No one would believe this was anything but murder. The plan to collect insurance money would fail unless they fixed the scene. Marilyn told Bryson and McKimble they needed to burn Jim to make it look like an accident. If Jim died in a fire, the injuries from the beating might be attributed to the fire or to the truck crash that caused the fire. Medical examiners would have trouble determining exactly what killed him with severe fire damage to the body. The fire would hide their crime. Bryson and McKimble carried Jim outside to his pickup truck parked in the driveway. Jim was a large man, and moving his body was difficult. They placed him in the bed of the truck initially. Jim was still alive at this point, though unconscious or semi-conscious. He made no sounds. He didn't resist, but he was breathing. Marilyn came outside and looked at what they had done. She handed the truck keys to Bryson. She looked at Jim's head injuries and said his head was busted open and it didn't look like an accident. She explicitly told them to burn him. McKimble later testified that Marilyn gave direct orders about burning Jim's body. This was her plan. Her voice, her instructions. Bryson got in the driver's seat of Jim's truck. McKimble followed in Marilyn's car. They drove to a location on NE 50th Street in northeast Oklahoma City. The area was isolated enough that they wouldn't be seen, but public enough that a burned vehicle would be found relatively quickly. The spot made sense as a possible location along Jim's route home. They repositioned Jim's body from the truck bed to the cab. They placed him behind the steering wheel to make it look like he was driving when the fire started. His body slumped to the side. The position wasn't natural, but they hoped fire damage would destroy evidence of how the body was positioned. McKimble took a rag from his pocket and stuffed it into the truck's gas tank. He lit the rag, trying to create an explosion. This was what they had seen in movies. Gas tanks explode when hit or ignited. The truck would blow up and the fire would consume everything. But reality doesn't match movies. The rag didn't cause an explosion. It just burned out. With the first attempt failed, Bryson tried a more direct approach. He poured gasoline over Jim's body and inside the cab of the truck. Gas fumes filled the air. Bryson lit the gasoline. This time, the fire caught immediately. Flames engulfed the truck cab. Jim's body was consumed by fire. As Bryson and McKimble drove away, McKimble looked back. He saw something that would haunt him later. Through the flames, he saw Jim's body move. Jim raised up in the seat. Jim Plants was alive when they set him on fire. The beating hadn't killed him. The fire did. Bryson and McKimble returned to the Plants' house. They had been gone perhaps 30 minutes. Marilyn was cleaning up blood when they arrived. She had cleaning supplies out and was working to remove evidence of the attack. McKimble helped clean the floor. Marilyn cleaned the baseball bats, wiping Jim's blood from the same bats he had bought to teach his son baseball. Marilyn directed the men to change out of their bloody clothes. She gave them clothes belonging to Jim. The men put on the dead man's clothes. Marilyn took their bloody clothing and placed everything in a bag. She told them to get rid of the bag completely. Throw it in a river or dump it somewhere it wouldn't be found. The men left the house with the bag of bloody evidence. They drove to a nearby river and threw the bag in, watching it sink. They stopped at a convenience store and used money from Jim's wallet to buy sandwiches and drinks. Then they went to a friend's house and told him what they had done. Bryson called Marilyn to check on her. The phone call created evidence that they remained in contact after the murder. Everything they did left traces that investigators would later find. Back at the house, Marilyn finished cleaning. She bought a rug to cover the blood stains that wouldn't come out of the floor. She worked through the early morning hours to make the house look normal. Her children slept through everything. When they woke up later, their father would be gone, but nothing in the house would suggest what happened. At 5:15 a.m. on August 26, 1988, someone driving through northeast Oklahoma City noticed a truck burning on NE 50th Street. The vehicle was fully engulfed in flames. The driver called emergency services. Fire trucks and police responded within minutes. Firefighters extinguished the burning truck quickly. Once the flames were out, they could see a body inside. The person was burned beyond immediate recognition. The body was slumped behind the steering wheel, positioned as if the person had been driving when the fire started. The driver's side door stood open. Police secured the scene and called for homicide detectives. The vehicle fire with a body could be an accident, but it required investigation. The location was odd. The truck sat on the side of the road in an area that didn't make obvious sense for a crash. There were no other vehicles involved, no signs of the truck hitting anything, just a burned truck with a burned body. Detectives arrived and began documenting the scene. The body's position bothered them immediately. Something felt wrong about how the person sat in the truck. The door being open was strange. If someone was trapped in a fire, why would the door be open? If the door was open, why didn't the person escape? The body itself was severely burned. Identifying the person by appearance would be impossible. The thermal damage was extensive, but the truck's license plate was still readable. Police ran the plate and got a name: James Earl Plants. The vehicle was registered to Jim Plants of Midwest City. Detectives needed positive identification of the body before notifying the family. The burns were too severe for visual identification. They would need dental records. A call went to the medical examiner's office to begin that process. Meanwhile, police started gathering information about Jim Plants to understand what they were dealing with. The preliminary investigation of the scene revealed details that made detectives suspicious. The fire pattern didn't match a natural vehicle fire. The damage suggested accelerant use. The body's position looked staged rather than natural. Most significantly, examination of the victim showed injuries inconsistent with a simple vehicle fire. Even through the fire damage, the medical examiner could see blunt force trauma to the skull. The victim had been hit in the head multiple times before the fire. The injuries were severe enough that they likely happened shortly before death. This wasn't someone who died in a crash and then burned. This was someone who was beaten and then burned. The case shifted from possible accident to definite homicide. Detectives began treating the scene as a murder investigation. They documented every detail. They photographed the truck from all angles. They collected evidence that survived the fire. Most importantly, they started building a timeline of Jim Plants' last hours. Dental records confirmed what the license plate suggested. The body in the burned truck was James Earl Plants, 33 years old, employed at the Daily Oklahoman. He had finished his shift around 4 a.m. His truck had been found burning around 5:15 a.m. Somewhere in that short window, Jim was killed. Detectives contacted Jim's employer. They learned he was a reliable employee who always showed up on time and left when his shift ended. He had clocked out at his regular time and left in his truck. Co-workers had seen him leave. Nothing seemed unusual about his departure. By midday on August 26th, detectives had a clear picture. Jim Plants was murdered. Someone beat him severely, placed him in his truck, drove to a remote location, and set the truck on fire. The fire was meant to hide the murder, but it hadn't worked. The evidence was clear enough that this was homicide. Now detectives needed to determine who killed Jim Plants. The standard investigation began with those closest to the victim: spouse, family, friends, co-workers. Anyone who had regular contact with Jim needed to be interviewed and either cleared or investigated further. The person who would know most about Jim's last hours was his wife, Marilyn. She was home when he left for work. She was presumably home when he should have returned. She would be the first person police interviewed, both to notify her of her husband's death and to get information about his activities and relationships. On Monday, August 29th, 3 days after Jim's body was found, detectives went to the Plants' home in Midwest City to speak with Marilyn. She appeared shocked when told her husband was dead. She cried. She asked questions about what happened. To the detectives, her initial reaction seemed genuine. But they were trained to look beyond surface emotions. They asked Marilyn to come to the police station for a formal interview. At the station, Marilyn told detectives she and Jim had a perfect marriage. They never fought. They never had problems. Jim was a good husband and father. She claimed she had no idea who would want to hurt him. She said Jim left for work Thursday evening as usual, and she expected him home Friday morning. When he didn't arrive, she assumed he had stayed late at work or stopped somewhere. She wasn't worried yet. Detectives pressed for more details. They asked about Jim's relationships with coworkers. They asked about family tensions. They asked about finances. Marilyn maintained that everything was fine. No money problems. No enemies, no reasons for anyone to harm Jim. She couldn't explain what happened. The interview style was gentle at first. Detectives wanted Marilyn comfortable and talking. They wanted to see if she would volunteer information or if they would have to dig it out. But as the interview continued, Marilyn's story started showing problems. Detectives knew from the autopsy that Jim died from being beaten and burned. They knew the murder happened at night or very early morning based on the timeline. They knew the body was moved after death and the fire was set intentionally. These facts didn't match Marilyn's story of a perfect marriage with no problems. They also knew something Marilyn might not know they knew. Other young men had already been brought in for questioning. Roderick Ferris, who had been offered money to kill Jim, told police about the murder plot. He described how Marilyn wanted her husband dead and was willing to pay for it. Chris Cato and Mario Houston confirmed they had been approached about killing Jim. The conspiracy was already exposed. Detectives confronted Marilyn with this information. They told her that multiple people said she had solicited murder. They said they knew about William Bryson. They knew about Clinton McKimball. They knew about the life insurance policy. Marilyn's story of a perfect marriage crumbled immediately. Faced with evidence, Marilyn changed tactics. She admitted she was having an affair with Bryson. She admitted she was unhappy in her marriage, but she insisted she had nothing to do with Jim's death. She claimed Bryson acted on his own. She said she never asked anyone to kill Jim. The solicitation witnesses were lying, she claimed. The whole thing was Bryson's idea. While detectives interviewed Marilyn, other officers located William Bryson and Clinton McKimball. Bryson was 18 years old. McKimball was 18. Both were brought in for questioning. Both were scared. Both had just committed their first serious crime, and neither was sophisticated enough to hide it well. In the holding cell before formal booking, Bryson tried to hang himself with his shoelaces. Guards found him and stopped the attempt. He was treated at a hospital and returned to custody. Later, in an isolation cell, Bryson tried to drown himself in the toilet. Again, guards intervened. Bryson's suicide attempts were seen as evidence of guilt and extreme psychological distress about what he had done. McKimball broke first. Facing life in prison or execution, and understanding that Bryson and Marilyn would likely blame him to save themselves, McKimball made a decision. He would cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The deal was straightforward: life in prison instead of death, in exchange for complete truthful testimony about what happened. McKimball's testimony gave prosecutors the inside story of the murder. He described the planning. He named Marilyn as the organizer. He explained the insurance motive. He described the night of the murder in detail. He admitted his own participation, but made clear that Marilyn directed everything and Bryson did most of the actual violence. Bryson also gave a statement to police. He was videotaped describing the crime. In the videotape, Bryson said he loved Marilyn Plants. He said Marilyn told him Jim was abusive. He claimed he killed Jim because of the abuse Marilyn described. He said he thought he was protecting her. The videotape showed a confused teenager trying to justify murder. With McKimball's cooperation and Bryson's statement, detectives had enough evidence to charge all three conspirators with first-degree murder. The physical evidence from the scene, the testimony of the other men who had been solicited, and the statements of those directly involved created an overwhelming case. On Monday, August 29th, police officially arrested Marilyn K. Plants, 27 years old, and charged her with first-degree murder. On Tuesday, August 30th, they arrested William Clifford Bryson and Clinton Eugene McKimball on the same charge. All three were held without bond. By late 1988, prosecutors in Oklahoma County had a complicated murder case before them. One crime, 3 defendants, and 3 very different stories. Each defendant had played a distinct role in the plot to kill James Jim Plants, and the challenge for the prosecution was to secure convictions while balancing the degrees of culpability. Clinton Eugene McKimball quickly removed himself from the death penalty equation. His attorneys negotiated a plea deal. He would plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole. In return, McKimble agreed to testify truthfully against the other two, Marilyn Plants, Jim's wife and the alleged mastermind, and William Bryson, Marilyn's teenage lover. On October 20, 1988, McKimble formally entered his plea. At just 18 years old, he would spend decades in prison but avoid execution. More importantly for prosecutors, McKimble became the state's key insider, a witness who could walk the jury through the murder conspiracy from the inside. With McKimble cooperating, the prosecution prepared for a joint trial of Marilyn and Bryson. Their defense lawyers pushed for separate trials, arguing that the two had conflicting defenses. Bryson would claim Marilyn manipulated him, while Marilyn would claim Bryson acted on his own. But Judge Charles Owens ruled against them, saying the evidence overlapped too much. Both would face the same jury in the same courtroom, side by side. The prosecution spent months building a strong, detailed case. They had forensic evidence, insurance paperwork, recruitment witnesses, and McKimble's detailed testimony. They would show motive, the $300,000 life insurance policy, and premeditation. Their argument was simple. Marilyn planned the murder, Bryson carried it out with McKimble, and all three shared equal guilt under Oklahoma law. The trial began in March 1989 before a packed courtroom. Family members, reporters, and curious onlookers filled the benches. The idea of a church-going wife accused of hiring teenagers to kill her husband shocked the community. Prosecutors began by humanizing Jim, a hard-working truck driver, loving father, and dedicated family man. They showed how ordinary his life was before greed destroyed it. Then came the scientific and witness evidence. The medical examiner testified that Jim died from blunt force head trauma and burns, confirming that he was alive when the fire began. Investigators presented photographs, blood evidence, and burn patterns tying the home to the dump site. Multiple witnesses testified that Marilyn had offered them money to kill her husband. Roderick Ferris, Chris Cato, and Mario Houston each described separate approaches by Marilyn, confirming a long-term, organized plan. The most devastating testimony came from Clinton McKimble himself. Calm and deliberate, he described the night of the murder. Waiting in the Plants' home, drinking and smoking crack, and ambushing Jim as he slept. He described Marilyn emerging afterward, looking down at her dying husband, and telling them to burn the body because it would never look like an accident. His account of seeing Jim raise up in the flames left the courtroom silent. Cross-examination focused on McKimble's plea deal, but he admitted his guilt openly, insisting that Marilyn directed the murder. The prosecution rested with a comprehensive, well-documented case. Physical, testimonial, and emotional evidence, all pointing to one conclusion. Marilyn Plants orchestrated her husband's killing for money. Bryson's defense tried to shift the narrative. They portrayed him as a vulnerable teenager, manipulated by an older woman. Bryson, just 16 when the relationship began, had grown up in foster care and lacked parental guidance. Marilyn had seduced and emotionally controlled him, convincing him that Jim was abusive and that killing him was an act of love. His attorneys argued that while Bryson was guilty of poor judgment, he was not the cold-blooded killer the prosecution described. Marilyn's defense had fewer options. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple men testified she'd solicited them. Physical items like the baseball bats from her home tied her directly to the murder. Her attorneys focused instead on mitigation, arguing that she was a product of her environment. Married at 16, uneducated, and emotionally trapped. They appealed to the jury's mercy, suggesting she lacked true malice despite her terrible decisions. When the case went to the jury, deliberations on guilt lasted less than 3 hours. On March 24, 1989, the verdicts came in. Both Marilyn K. Plants and William Clifford Bryson were guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, solicitation, conspiracy, and arson. The trial then moved to sentencing. Prosecutors outlined 2 aggravating factors. The murder was committed for financial gain, and it was especially heinous and cruel. They reminded jurors that Jim was beaten, kidnapped, and burned alive, suffering unimaginable pain. The defense emphasized mitigating circumstances: Bryson's youth and emotional immaturity, Marilyn's lack of criminal history and troubled past. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its final recommendation: death sentences for both Marilyn and Bryson. Judge Owens agreed, formally sentencing both to death by lethal injection, plus additional concurrent prison terms for their other charges. Jim Plantz's family, who had attended every day of the trial, felt a somber relief. His father, Earl Plantz, called the verdict just, but admitted it couldn't heal their loss. His sister Karen said they were grateful for justice, yet haunted by the betrayal. That the woman their family once embraced had orchestrated Jim's death. In the end, both Marilyn Plantz and William Bryson were sent to death row, beginning years of appeals and waiting, their fates sealed by the decisions they made one August night in 1988. After the 1989 convictions, Marilyn Plantz and William Bryson entered the long and complex appeals process typical of death penalty cases. Their defense teams raised multiple legal challenges, hoping to overturn their convictions or death sentences. Bryson's attorneys argued that his trial should have been separated from Marilyn's, claiming the joint trial denied him a fair defense since each blamed the other. The appellate court rejected this, saying a joint trial was proper because their roles were intertwined. They also challenged the exclusion of a videotaped confession that showed Bryson's emotional distress. But the court ruled the omission was harmless because other evidence reflected the same. Additional appeals claimed mental incompetence, improper jury instructions, and errors regarding accomplice testimony, but none persuaded the judges. On May 20, 1994, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld Bryson's conviction and death sentence in Bryson v. State, finding no reversible errors. Marilyn Plantz's appeals followed a similar path. Her lawyers cited pretrial publicity, ineffective counsel, and failure to present mitigating evidence about her childhood abuse, strict upbringing, and alleged sexual assaults. They argued this background could have influenced sentencing. But the appellate court ruled that any past trauma was too distant to mitigate her calculated, financially motivated murder. Her defense also raised the issue of racial bias, claiming the jury may have been influenced because Bryson was black and she was white, but the court found no evidence that race played a role. On the same day as Bryson's ruling, May 20, 1994, Marilyn's conviction and sentence were also affirmed. Both defendants pursued post-conviction and federal habeas corpus appeals, arguing violations of constitutional rights. These cases reached the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, which upheld both convictions. The courts found the trials fundamentally fair and the evidence of guilt overwhelming. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to review either case, denying Marilyn's petition in 1995 and Bryson's in 2000. With that, all legal avenues were exhausted, clearing the way for execution. As Marilyn's execution date neared in 2001, an unrelated but explosive controversy emerged: the Joyce Gilchrist scandal. Gilchrist, a longtime Oklahoma City police forensic chemist who had testified in the Plantz case, was accused of falsifying and exaggerating forensic evidence in dozens of trials. An FBI review of her work found serious errors in 6 out of 8 cases examined, including misidentification of hair and fiber evidence. The revelations triggered a statewide crisis, as Gilchrist's testimony had helped secure over 20 death penalty convictions. One of her cases, the 1986 rape conviction of Jeffrey Pierce, was overturned after DNA proved his innocence. He was released on May 1, 2001, the very day Marilyn Plantz was scheduled for execution. The coincidence fueled public outcry. Defense lawyers and civil rights groups urged Governor Frank Keating to halt executions until Gilchrist's cases were reviewed, arguing that her misconduct cast doubt on the entire system. However, Attorney General Drew Edmondson concluded that Gilchrist's testimony in the Plantz case was minor and not essential. The conviction rested on witness accounts, confessions, and overwhelming physical evidence. Governor Keating accepted that assessment and refused to delay the execution. Marilyn's final appeals citing the Gilchrist scandal were denied. While the controversy didn't save her, it had lasting consequences. Gilchrist was suspended, then fired in 2001 after investigations confirmed widespread misconduct. Reviews of over 1,700 cases followed, and several wrongful convictions were overturned. The scandal permanently tainted Gilchrist's reputation and raised enduring questions about forensic integrity and trust in the justice system. But for Marilyn Plants, it came too late. William Clifford Bryson's execution was scheduled for June 15, 2000. He had spent nearly 12 years on death row since his conviction in 1989. During those years, Bryson's son, William Clifford Bryson III, visited his father regularly. The boy's grandparents, Bryson's father and stepmother, raised him and brought him to the prison so he could know his father despite the circumstances. The State Pardon and Parole Board held a clemency hearing on June 6, 2000. This was Bryson's last chance to have his sentence reduced from death to life in prison. His attorneys presented arguments for mercy. They emphasized that Bryson was 18 when he committed the crime. They described his difficult childhood in foster care. They argued Marilyn Plants manipulated him. Jim Plants's family attended the clemency hearing. His daughter, Trina Plants Wells, now 21 years old, spoke to the board. She described how her father's murder had affected her life. She talked about growing up without her father. The testimony was emotional. According to reports, even board members were passing tissues around as Trina spoke. The board voted 4-0 to deny clemency. Bryson would be executed as scheduled. His attorneys filed final appeals to federal courts seeking stays of execution. These appeals were denied. The United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. Bryson had exhausted all legal options. On June 14, 2000, Bryson had his last visits with family. His father spent time with him. His 12-year-old son visited, brought by his grandparents. The visit was difficult. Bryson told his son that what happened was his fault. He took responsibility. He told his son not to make the same mistakes. They said goodbye, knowing they would never see each other again outside the execution chamber. Bryson ate his final meal on June 14th. He requested 10 fried shrimp, a salad, a strawberry drink, a slice of German chocolate cake, a pint of ice cream, and a hot apple fritter. The meal was served, and Bryson ate what he wanted. This was the last food he would ever consume. Bryson met with his attorney and spiritual advisors. He made final preparations. He wrote last letters to family members. He spent his final hours in a holding area near the execution chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. 13 relatives and friends of Jim Plants registered as witnesses for the execution. They wanted to see the sentence carried out. Jim's father Earl, his sisters Karen and Sharon, and other family members made the trip to McAlester to witness Bryson's death. Bryson's father also registered as a witness. He would watch his son die. And young William Clifford Bryson III, just 12 years old, would be there too. The prison allowed him to attend because he wanted to say goodbye to his father. His 12th birthday had been 5 days earlier. Shortly after midnight, on June 15, 2000, witnesses were brought into the viewing area. They could see into the execution chamber through glass. Bryson was already strapped to the gurney, IVs inserted in his arms. He could see his son through the glass. Bryson was given an opportunity to make a final statement. He spoke to Jim Plants's family. He said he was sorry for what he had done. He hoped they could find peace and move forward with their lives. He didn't try to excuse his actions or minimize what he did. He simply apologized. The warden signaled for the execution to begin. A cocktail of drugs flowed through the IVs into Bryson's veins. First a sedative to render him unconscious, then a paralytic to stop breathing. Finally, a drug to stop the heart. The process took several minutes. Bryson's breathing slowed and stopped. His heart stopped beating. At 12:14 a.m. on June 15, 2000, William Clifford Bryson was pronounced dead. He was 29 years old. He had spent nearly 12 years on death row. The murder he participated in at age 18 ended his life at age 29. The witnesses filed out. Jim Plants' family told reporters that Bryson's execution didn't bring them the closure they hoped for. Karen Lowery said it was a no-win situation. Nobody won. Sharon Cotton noted that Bryson and Marilyn had lived nearly 12 years after murdering Jim. That was 12 years longer than Jim got to live. Young William Bryson left the prison with his grandparents. He had just watched the state kill his father. He went back to Oklahoma City to continue his life without his father, just as Trina and Christopher Plants had to continue their lives without theirs. Bryson's execution was the 9th in Oklahoma that year. It was the 4th execution in a 22-day period. Oklahoma's execution rate was among the highest in the nation per capita. The state had fully embraced capital punishment and was applying it regularly. Marilyn Plants remained on death row. Her execution would come 11 months later, but first she would have her own clemency hearing and her own final days to prepare for death. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied her final appeal on February 26, 2001, Marilyn Plants' execution became certain. Attorney General Drew Edmondson immediately requested the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals to set an execution date. On March 8, 2001, the court scheduled Marilyn's execution for May 1, 2001. Marilyn had spent nearly 12 years on death row at Mabel Bassett Correctional Center in Oklahoma City. Death row for women was separate from the main prison population. She lived in a cell designed for maximum security, with limited movement and constant supervision. For 12 years, she knew this day was coming. During her time in prison, Marilyn maintained contact with her family. Her sisters visited when they could. She wrote letters to relatives. But for most of the 12 years, she had no contact with her children. Trina and Christopher had been 9 and 6 when their father was murdered. By 2001, they were 21 and 18, adults who had grown up without either parent. About a year before her execution, Trina began visiting her mother. The reconciliation happened gradually. Trina was angry for many years. She couldn't understand how her mother could have arranged her father's murder. But as she got older and processed her trauma, Trina decided she needed to face her mother before it was too late. The visits were difficult at first. Marilyn cried. Trina cried. They talked about what happened and why. Marilyn never denied planning the murder. She took responsibility. She told Trina she was sorry for taking her father away. She said she made terrible choices that destroyed their family. Christopher also visited his mother. Though their relationship remained strained, he went to see her, but couldn't fully reconcile with what she had done. The visits were shorter and less emotional than with Trina, but at least he saw her before she died. For years, Marilyn said she didn't want a clemency hearing. She accepted her sentence and didn't want to make appeals that would only prolong the process. But when Trina started visiting regularly, Marilyn changed her mind. She wanted to fight for more time with her daughter. She wanted the chance to build some relationship before she died. Marilyn's clemency hearing was held in April 2001. Her attorneys presented arguments for mercy. They described her difficult childhood and early marriage. They argued she had been a model prisoner for 12 years. They emphasized that she had reconciled with her daughter and deserved more time. Trina submitted a videotaped statement to the board. She cried through the entire statement. She said she had forgiven her mother. She said she couldn't bear the thought of finally having a relationship with her mother, only to watch her be executed. She begged the board to spare her mother's life. She said her mother deserved a second chance. Jim Plants' family attended the hearing. They spoke against clemency. Earl Plants said Marilyn had lived 12 years since killing his son. That was 12 years more than Jim got. Karen Lowry said the execution wouldn't truly satisfy them, but justice required it. The family wanted the sentence carried out. The Pardon and Parole Board voted to deny clemency. Marilyn would be executed as scheduled. Her attorneys filed final appeals, but courts denied them all. Governor Keating refused to grant a stay despite the Joyce-Gilchrist controversy. The execution would proceed on May 1st. In her final days, Marilyn spoke to reporters. She said she had found Christianity in prison. She said God had forgiven her even if people couldn't. She expressed remorse for what she did to Jim and to her children. She said the worst part was knowing she had destroyed her children's lives. Marilyn was asked about her last meal. She requested chicken taco salad, Mexican pizza, 2 enchiritos, 2 chicken soft tacos, cinnamon twists, pecan pie, and 2 cans of Coca-Cola. The meal was served on April 30th. She ate what she wanted and spent her last evening preparing for death. 7 people registered as witnesses for Marilyn. 3 cousins, several spiritual advisors, an attorney, and an investigator would watch her die. Trina and Christopher decided not to attend. They didn't want their last memory of their mother to be watching her die on a gurney. 15 people registered as witnesses for Jim's family. Earl Plants, Karen Lowery, Sharon Cotton, and other family members would witness the execution. They wanted to see justice completed. 12 family members and 3 supporters attended. On the evening of May 1st, Marilyn was moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. She spent her final hours with spiritual advisors. She prayed. She wrote final letters to her children. She prepared herself for death, as much as anyone can prepare for their own execution. At around 9 p.m., Marilyn was moved to the execution chamber. She was strapped to the gurney. IVs were inserted into her arms. The witnesses were brought in and seated in the viewing area. Through the glass, they could see Marilyn lying on the gurney, waiting to die. Marilyn was given an opportunity for final words. Marilyn spoke clearly. She thanked her family and those who came to support her. She addressed Trina and Christopher, even though they weren't present. She said she loved them very much. She spoke about God's love and her Christian faith. She ended by saying if anyone wanted to see her again, they must be born again. Her final statement lasted about a minute. The warden signaled for the execution to proceed. At 9:07 p.m., the drugs began flowing through the IVs. The first chemical was a sedative intended to render Marilyn unconscious. As it entered her system, she made several snorting sounds. Her breathing changed. Then she fell quiet. Within moments, she appeared unconscious. The paralytic drug followed, stopping her breathing. Then the final chemical stopped her heart. The process took only a few minutes. Medical personnel monitored her vital signs. When her heart stopped completely, they confirmed death. At 9:11 p.m. on May 1, 2001, Marilyn K. Plants was pronounced dead. She was 40 years old. She had spent nearly 13 years on death row for arranging the murder of her husband to collect insurance money. The sentence imposed by the jury in 1989 had been carried out. Jim Plant's family filed out of the witness area. They spoke briefly to reporters. Karen Lowery repeated what she had said before. The punishment didn't fit the crime. Lethal injection was too easy compared to being beaten and burned alive. But it was the justice system they had, and the sentence had been carried out. Earl Plants said he felt relief that the legal process had finally ended. 12 years was a long time to wait for justice. He acknowledged that executing Marilyn didn't bring Jim back. Nothing could do that. But the sentence had been served, and perhaps now they could move forward. Marilyn's body was removed from the execution chamber. Her family claimed her remains. She was buried in a small ceremony attended by family members who still supported her. The media coverage was extensive but brief. Within days, the news cycle moved on to other stories. The case left lasting damage for multiple families. Jim Plant's children grew up without their father. Trina and Christopher had to live knowing their mother arranged their father's murder. They were raised by their grandparents, who stepped in when both parents were gone. Earl and Betty Plants raised Trina and Christopher as their own children. They provided stability and love, but they were elderly and struggled with the physical demands of raising young children. They provided what they could while grieving their own son and dealing with the trauma of his murder. Trina struggled with forgiveness and anger for years. She eventually reconciled with her mother before the execution, but that reconciliation was complicated. She had lost both parents to the same crime. Christopher's path was even harder. He never fully reconciled with his mother before she died. If you found this story insightful, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of real crime and human consequence.